Good evening, and welcome to the Museum of Science. We are thrilled to present tonight's program and pleased that so many of you wanted to attend. Now I'd like to introduce the President and Director of the Museum of Science, Mr. Janis Miaulis.
Thank you and welcome. And to tell you the truth, I'm not turning off my cell phone. I have it on vibrate because my daughter got her driver's license yesterday. And she just called me to tell me, I have to go to CVS to buy chocolate kisses for my field hockey team tomorrow. So I cannot wait to see what happened at the parking lot of the CVS. So we're very thrilled to have you all here today, and we're proud that the museum is the venue for this special evening and to open the Boston venue of the National Park Series. We're also happy to have one of my favorite gals, Mrs. Barbara Washburn, with us this evening. And with her late husband, Brad, are both major figures for the Museum of Science. They were both interviewed in 2005 for this National Parks documentary about their 1947 climb of Denali. They come across as warm, funny, and generous in the series. And note that Barbara was the only woman on this climb. And you cannot imagine what Barbara went through with Brad. You know, she climbed mountains, went through ice. Sometimes my wife, comments on how much she does for the Museum of Science, and I should take her up to climb Mount Everest. Brad and Barbara were both instrumental in transforming the museum from a traditional natural history museum to one of the best interactive science centers in the world. You'll see some of their work in mountain climbing today at both the pictures and the film series. The series was directed and written by filmmakers Ken Burns and Dayton Duncan, who have collaborated on many award-winning documentaries, very diverse documentaries, such as The Civil War to Baseball, which was the subject of a special museum exhibit actually last year. It was a great exhibit we had. Ken and Dayton have put together another splendid series on the history of the individuals and ideas that established and care for our national parks. The footage is truly amazing, as you'll see, and some of the best breathtaking cinematography of our national parks to date. We have, with signature techniques of using still photography and archival footage, Ken and Dayton tell the stories of not just the place, but also the people, both famous and not famous, who made the national parks possible for all of us. And now it's my privilege and pleasure to introduce Ken Burns.
Good evening. Good evening. Thank you. We are so excited to be here with you all to come to this extraordinary institution in partnership with our great friends at WGBH. PBS has been at the center of my life for more than 30 years, and I can't imagine a better place to be a filmmaker than working in PBS. And this is such an extraordinary, amazing museum that we're thrilled that we could have our Boston premiere of our series here. There are two people missing tonight, and I just wanted to address a little bit. Another great friend of this museum is a man named Bob Jassy, who passed away earlier. His widow Susan is here, and a dear friend from Dayton and my hometown of Walpole. And of course, we miss Brad so much, so very, very much, a part of our film. And Barbara, we're so thrilled that you're here and could share this evening with us. And we would like to just start off and tell you that we dedicate this entire evening to you and to the memory of Brad. We're very, very happy that you could join us tonight. We have an opportunity to share the special messages our past, our common heritage, continually direct our way. Let us listen. Let us listen. Too often, as a culture, we have ignored this joyful noise, becoming in the process blissfully ignorant of the power those past lives and stories and moments have over this moment, and indeed our unknown future. I am interested in that power of history, and I'm interested in its many varied voices, not just the voices of the old top-down version of our past, which would try to convince us that American history is only the story of great men, capital G, capital M, and not just those recent voices that have entered our studies, voices which seem to suggest that our history is merely a catalog of white European crimes. I'm interested in listening to the voices of a true, honest, complicated past that is unafraid of controversy and tragedy, but equally drawn to those stories and moments that suggest an abiding faith in the human spirit, and particularly the unique role this remarkable and sometimes dysfunctional republic seems to play in the positive progress of mankind. That quite simply has been my creed, my mantra, the lens through which I have tried to see our histories, our stories, over the last 35 years. And in a way, I have to admit that I've made the same film over and over again. Each film asks one deceptively simple question: who are we? Who are we? Who are those strange and complicated people who like to call themselves Americans? What does an investigation of the past tell us, not only where we've been, but where we are and potentially where we might be going as a people? American history is a loud, raucous, moving, exquisite collection of noises that in the aggregate often combine to make the sweetest kind of music I know. And we've tried to listen to this music as much as we can in putting together the films we have made. It is a kind of emotional archaeology that we are attempting, straining to listen to the ghosts and echoes of an almost inexpressibly wise past that paradoxically points us confidently towards those future horizons that will comprise our fate as country, as a community, as individuals. So I have gone a little bit too far and buried the lead, a newspaper person had said. On Sunday, September 27th, PBS, WGBH, will begin broadcasting our 6-part, 12-hour series on the history of the national parks. I emphasize the word history. This film is not a travelogue. It's not a nature film, though I think you will see some nice images of nature in it. Instead, it is a history of the ideas and individuals that made this uniquely American thing happen. For the first time in human experience, land, great tracts of natural landscape, was set aside not for kings or royalty or the very rich, as had been the case in all of human history up to that point, but for everyone and for all time. We invented it. It's an American idea, and like the idea of freedom itself, it has been exported around the world. We have spent 10 years working on this project. It has been, to say a labor of love is such a cliche, but I can't imagine a more satisfying production than the one that Dayton and I have been able to work on for this time. We've been shooting for more than 6 years, and the series we plan to present, I think, will reflect not just the glories of the national parks, but an untold story of the myriad number of individuals, so-called ordinary people, who fell in love with a particular place and then devoted their lives to saving it. That's the story we wanted to tell, a kind of complicated intertwining of 50 or so individual biographies set against the backdrop of, I hope you will agree, some of the most spectacular landscapes on Earth. And that's what we struggle to do. Now, you have to understand that filmmakers hate to show clips. I mean, we have just labored for 10 years. And suddenly we're asked to come here, and after whittling down literally hundreds and hundreds of hours of footage, thousands upon thousands of rare and never-before-seen archival material, hundreds of hours of interviews and archival footage, we're suddenly asked that the film that we've spent so long carving down to 6 episodes, 12 hours, we now suddenly have to show some fraction of that before you. And so just a little bit before we walked in here, Dayton and I were able to procure a couple of keys for this room, and we've decided to show the whole thing. It's okay. If you don't take any bathroom breaks or have any food, you'll be out at about 7 o'clock tomorrow morning, just in time to get back to work. So settle in, get comfortable. No. Unfortunately, we do have to show some clips. Before I go further and introduce the author of our enterprise, I'd also like to point out someone else here, and that's Bob Gallery, who is the president of Bank of America. Bank of America is one of our corporate sponsors for this film and has, in fact, signed up for some future films of ours. And, you know, the compact of not just public television, not just the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, but the whole United States requires an understanding that we're in this together and that all of the good things come from us all participating, all levels of society and of our businesses. And so to enjoy the support, as I have for so many years of Bank of America, to look forward to that support is a real treat. And I'd like to thank Bob Gallery, and I hope you will too. I was at WGBH earlier this afternoon, and I recall just before I stood to the podium a wonderful quote from Carson McCullers, the novelist. And she talks about in one of her books, the we of me, which speaks to this kinship that we found in the national park, that I think we celebrate in public television, that we certainly do here at this museum, that we hope is reflected in the film that we've made. And for this particular project, and for many projects that I've worked on over the last 20 years, the we of me has included Dayton Duncan. In this case, it was his idea to do this film. He brought it to me. It was an instantaneous yes. And we have worked and struggled over these 10 years. We have traveled from the gates of the Arctic in northern Alaska to the dry Tortugas in the Virgin Islands. We've gone from Hawaii volcanoes to the top of Mount Cadillac in Acadia National Park, where the rays of sun first hit this glorious republic every morning. It has been a spectacular partnership. Dayton, you must know, is not just an accomplished filmmaker and film writer. He has been in politics and public policy most of his life. He is an author of many, many books, not just the companion books to our documentary series, but a magnificent book called Out West on the history of recreating Lewis and Clark's journey. He made a film called Grassroots, studying the bottom-up story of the New Hampshire primary, and a wonderful book called Miles from Nowhere that examines life in those rural counties that have fewer than 2 people per square mile, the old definition of the frontier, which supposedly closed in 1890, apparently in a few counties west of the Mississippi is still magnificently open. Anyway, it is my great pleasure to introduce not only a man of such a long resume, but also a fellow resident of Walpole, New Hampshire, the town I've called my home for the last 30 years, last week, and my best friend. Would you please welcome Dayton Duncan?
Thank you, Ken. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I, too, want to say how great it is to have a fellow Walpolean, Susan Jassy, here with us, and how much we all miss Bob. And to say that in the year 2000, one of the great pleasures of my life and my wife Diane's was a trip to Denali National Park while I was researching this book. And we were there with the National Park Foundation, and Diane and I were asked to climb into a car with 2 people for the long ride from the entrance of Denali National Park. It's a 90-mile gravel road that goes to the place that we're going to be staying, a place called Camp Denali. And in the back were Brad and Barbara Washburn. That was the first time that we'd met. And if it's your first time at Denali National Park, and the drive up that road, you're sitting next to these 2 people. I mean, it really doesn't get any better than that. He told us and she told us all the stories of their climb of McKinley and other times and other adventures besides just there at Denali. That night, Brad, after a brutally long day, spoke to the board members of the National Park Foundation, and when he was done, he said, I can only take a few questions because I just learned that there's an elder hostel group up at this other place just 2 miles up the road, and they've asked if I can come and speak to them too. And I would hate to not to do that. And so, all of us were totally toasted from the, new time zone and the long drive. And there was Brad at 90 something or other going up to talk to a group. And the only other thing to say is that it snowed on the last night that we were there. We had to follow a snowplow to get out in this bus that we were all in, including Brad and Barbara. And when the snowplow had taken us over the last pass and we didn't need him anymore, he stopped the snowplow, but he wouldn't let us pass until he got a chance to shake the hand of Brad Washburn. That's the kind of guy that, that Brad was, and the way that we all should remember him, not his great spirit as well as his great accomplishments. So we are very happy to show you this tonight, and so happy that you're here tonight, Barbara. We're going to show you 6 clips. They account for about, 1/14 of the whole film. Ken's threat to the contrary notwithstanding. The first is the full introduction to our film, so I don't need to tell you much about that. I do want to try to make it possible so that as we leap from across 150 years of time, that you don't get the bends from, time warp. So I show the first 14 minutes of our film, the introduction, which is one of the cast of characters in our film are these places themselves, what we call the treasure house of superlatives. And the only thing you need to know is that each of these places that you'll see in the introduction is a place that over the course of the next 12 hours you would return to and find out its deep history of, how it was formed, what made it unique, and then the story of how it became a national park, and most particularly the person or persons behind that story. Then we're going to leap clear across, immediately after the introduction, our first story starts in the year 1851. And our first episode ends in 1890. And our second episode starts in 1890 and goes to 1915. And we're shooting well over that into our third episode, where we're going to tell the story of how the first park east of the Mississippi got created. And the couple things you need to know is that this is now around 1915 or so. There isn't a national park service until the year 1916. Prior to that, the handful of parks that have been created, all of them in the West, are guarded by the Army. And a fellow by the name of Stephen Mather, whose name you will hear, has decided to take on the cause of crusading for making these haphazard collection of parks into a system, and of convincing Congress finally to pass a bill to create a national park service so that one agency of government will be solely responsible for caring for these national treasures. The third clip is also from that third episode, and it is the story of a much different park up in the wilds of Alaska, and it includes some people who you will recognize, and I won't say anything more about that. Then we return to the very last story of our third episode, which is to kill the suspense of whether because otherwise you'll be dying of suspense. Do they actually make a park east of the Mississippi? We're going to show you the second part of that story, which is the concluding part of our third episode. Our fifth clip is from our fourth episode, which is basically 1920 to 1929, and it's about these wonderful people who are the protectors of our parks, the park rangers. In April of this year, the National Park Service surprised Ken and me when we were showing some clips to them at the Interior Department in Washington, D.C., and the director of the Park Service gave us the certificate and then declared us honorary park rangers. And there's only about 50 people that have had that, and we were both thrilled and surprised. Okay, thank you. No. It wasn't more than a certificate. We also got the hat. And Ken and I both treasure our hats, and mine to the extent that about 2 weeks after I had received it, my wife Diane politely inquired when it was that I thought that I would not be wearing it to bed anymore. She still, if I'm in a cranky mood, she'll go quietly retrieve the ranger hat and bring it out and said, wear this, because if you're wearing a ranger hat, you can't be in a bad mood. So this is from our 4th episode. Now, just to know, by this time there is a National Park Service. Stephen Mather has created it. He is the first director. His right-hand man, Horace Albright, will become the second director of the National Park Service. And then finally, a very short piece that is representative of something else in our film. Not only these majestic landscapes, not only this chronological narrative story that we try to tell about this idea and the people behind it and how it grew and evolved and changed and moved around and to embrace not only majestic scenery but swamps down in the Everglades and archaeological sites at Mesa Verde, and then history, such as here in Boston, that now becomes part of the National Park Service and the National Park system. But what we also found is that the experts that we interviewed, the people who knew the most about the different topics that they were talking about, all had something that they really wanted to tell us, and it had nothing to do with that. It had to do with what is really part of the power of the national park idea, and that is a personal connection that is available to anybody who avails himself of going to one of these precious parts of our landscape. This opportunity to touch eternity, a place that is unchanged, and you can feel the fact that it hasn't changed. And you can feel the possibility that it won't change, so that your children and their children can have that same experience. That's what the national parks offer, is the chance to touch that eternity and that timelessness, and to feel that you are part of something bigger than yourself. And time after time after time, different people we interviewed wanted to tell us that story. And we finally realized that the smartest thing we could do as filmmakers was to step aside and let them tell that. And we were even smarter if we included it in the film itself. And so our final little clip is one of those many morsels that we sprinkle throughout the film. And in this one in particular is by a young park ranger who we think, starting in October 3rd, the day after our series ends, will be the best known national park ranger in America. And you'll see why when you watch this. So if we could dim the lights and start it, and then when it's over, Ken and I'll be happy to come back and take some questions from you. Thank you so much for coming.
Okay, don't be shy.
Or just
Yes.
shout it out and we'll repeat it too. The question is there a particular site that we'd like to see made into a national park? Since the great addition of 7 new national parks in Alaska in 1980, which added 7 to McKinley and changed McKinley's name to Denali, there have been, I think, 10 new national parks. Virtually all of them were already set aside as national monuments by previous presidents. So there haven't been really any new places preserved in that way. There's a proposal, as some of you may know, in Maine of buying up land in the Great North Woods there and making a national park out of that. It's being met with fierce local resistance, which is firmly in the history of every national park that exists in America today. There are some places that were set aside by some more recent presidents, particularly President Clinton, in the 90s as national monuments. that would not surprise me that in 10 or 20 years, when the resistance to him having done that eases a little bit, that there probably may be enough support in Congress to make some of them a national park. My great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren will be visiting Moon National Park, or maybe it's just maybe too expensive, Tranquility Bay National Historic Site. I'm a believer. There's been two camps in national parks over the years. One is more of a purist, needs to be to meet what Robert Sterling Yard, one of the early advocates of national parks, called national park standards. And that led him and the organization he led to oppose places like Shenandoah National Park because it wasn't quite big enough or pristine enough, or Mammoth National Park or Kings Canyon, because there were compromises that had to be made for it. On the other hand, there are those that I would put myself more in the camp of, which is if you get the chance to save the place, save the place. And we can figure out later on, is it quite up to this standard or that standard? But if you lose it, you lose it. If you protect it, you still have to continue protecting it, but, protect it when you can.
I would just add to that just coming from Utah in the past couple of weeks, that up in the upper right-hand corner of Utah, in a monument that's mostly in Colorado, is Dinosaur National Monument, spills a little bit into Utah, and that has one of the most beautiful places, Echo Park, and that would be, if I were president, the first thing that I would do. And I would also go down into southern Utah in the controversial place that Dayton was probably referring to when he was talking about the response to President Clinton's actions in Grand Staircase Escalante. And to elevate that to national park status would create a kind of a fish hook, an arc of amazing, amazing parks, beginning at Dinosaur and then Arches, Canyonlands, Capitol Reef, Grand Staircase, Bryce, and Zion, that would be hard pressed to beat as a kind of one arc in one state, spilling over a little bit into Colorado. That's what I do. Yes, sir.
I would like to just say, I thought this was extraordinarily nicely done. But I would appreciate it if you could tell us a little bit about the troubles and difficulties of getting Yellowstone Park established. Because my understanding is that it was an extraordinarily close vote. And
Yeah,
I don't know what were the controversies around it, but since that was the first national park in the world, it'd be nice to hear just a little bit about it.
Sure. This was in 1872. There had been rumors for many years filtering back to the east of a place where mud boiled and water spouted out of the ground, and people laughed at it. When some folks came back from it, wrote up a description, sent it east. Lippincott's magazine said, "We're sorry, we don't print fiction." It wasn't until the Hayden Exposition of 1871 showed up with scientists and also, most importantly, a photographer and an artist, Thomas Moran, the artist, and William Henry Jackson, the photographer, that could bring back to the East Coast. You could look with your eyes and see, my God, there is this geyser, and there are lots of them, and look at that waterfall, and look at this formation of this hot springs called Mammoth Terraces, that started to convince Congress that there really was something there. 8 years earlier, they had set aside Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove of big trees, and said, you cannot homestead here, you can't mine here, you can't log here. But then they gave it to the state of California for safekeeping. In 1872, Wyoming was not a state, and so there was no state to give it to. And so, number one, that's how it became the world's first national park, simply because there was no state. And later, through the experiences of the lackluster state oversight of Yosemite Valley, California eventually gave Yosemite Valley back to the United States, so it became a national park. That model of a national park proved better than state control. In the halls of Congress, when it was being debated, There was no sense, there was no John Muir-like voice of the wilderness saying, save these pristine places much. What there were was people saying, this is worthless land, worthless by mid-19th century standards. It was too high elevation to farm. There weren't any valuable minerals that they thought at the time. It was too inaccessible for the logging. It was worthless by that standard of what the Congress usually did in those days, which was take public domain and turn it into private property in one way or another. Given that it was worthless, then they were more willing to listen to setting it aside and preserving it. They were also motivated by the fact that they were tired of being belittled by Europeans who would come to the New World and think of us as inferior people in an inferior continent. And now we had some things like Yosemite and Yellowstone. We could say, we don't have a Parthenon, but we've got Yosemite Valley. We don't have the Louvre, but look at this geyser spout. Something to be proud of, to sort of push back at Europeans who also were ridiculing us for taking the one great natural wonder that was well known, Niagara Falls, and over-commercializing it. So that was another motivation, sort of wounded national pride. It wasn't, my recollection is that it wasn't that tight a vote. The interesting thing is nobody there said, this is something new here. There's never been, we in retrospect say, this is something new under the sun, the world's first national park. There's no discussion whatsoever in the congressional testimony and debate that says, let's think this over. This is a new model of something. None of that whatsoever. And finally, the most important thing is that the Great Northern Railway had floated $100 million worth of bonds to build a new transcontinental railway across the Dakotas and Montana. And the notion that there was this incredible geyser world out there, they figured would be good for the passengers that they would need to support the railroad they were building to pay off the bonds that they had floated. And they worked very powerfully and quietly behind the scenes in Congress, and it's probably more due to them than anything else that the world's first national park was created. And that was the case in many other national parks in the early days. Rainier, Yosemite, many of the others, there was a powerful railroad lobby behind that movement. And I think that's one of the interesting things we find in our story. I'm sorry, I'm getting into a long lecture here. One of the things that's interesting to us is the sort of law of unintended consequences. That the important thing was that it was saved, that it was set aside. And that here in the United States, each generation that is responsible for redefining what all men are created equal means, or what the meaning of the pursuit of happiness is, also have the chance to reinterpret what the purpose of a national park might be. So early national parks were meant as tourist destinations for the mighty railroad lobbies. It wasn't until much later in our 6th episode that we get into how parks became the place where you preserved nature itself. In our 2nd episode is where the bison are have found their last refuge in Yellowstone, but they're still being poached and slaughtered there and are dwindled down to a couple of dozen. And a famous poaching case prompts Congress to finally give teeth to the regulations so that it was really against the law to kill a bison in Yellowstone National Park. Yellowstone hadn't been created to save the bison. But had Yellowstone not been created, there would no longer be the most magnificent species of animal this continent's ever created on this continent anymore. And that's sort of the power and interest to us of this idea that we follow, of the twists and turns it takes.
And all of this is in the film, which will now close the doors and you can watch, sir.
We have a question from some of the folks in the overflow space. One is, if you could only visit one national park, which would you recommend and why?
Well, you know, the corollary to this is somebody who came up to a ranger in Yosemite and said, I've only got 1 hour. You know, what should I do? He said, if you've only got 1 hour to see Yosemite, you should go over on that rock and sit down and cry. You know, if you've only got one national park, you're in a little bit better shape, assuming that it's going to be more than an hour. And everyone has their favorites. And the favorites usually have less to do with how spectacular scenery is than the kind of associations, you know, that you have, personal ones. Who took you there? I've been very interested in the game of baseball all of my life, and I like the other sports, and they're pretty great. But when you describe something in basketball or football, they go right and describe the action. You know, Joe Montana threw a pass to Jerry Rice, and they caught it for a touchdown. Michael Jordan hit a three-pointer at the buzzer, and we won. But baseball stories always begin, my mom or my dad or a grandpa took me to a game. And so as you stand on the rim of the Grand Canyon and you contemplate that Precambrian Vishnu schist that is 1.7 billion years old, nearly half the age of the planet, as we say in the introduction, you feel a kind of insignificance, and you remember that moment. But it also matters very much whose hand you're holding as you're looking at that, you know, your parents or your wife or someone close. And that's a huge, important part of what it is. And for me, it has to do with Yosemite and a memory that it gave back to me of an early time in 1959 when I was 6 years old, and my dad took me to that inferior park of Shenandoah, which is not inferior in my mind in any way, because it is so special, because I had that time at a difficult point in my life when, you know, I had my dad for the weekend, and I'd never had that before, and I never had it afterwards. And, you know, for other people, Dayton, it's Glacier. I think that it has to do with the association. So I don't know what to say. Go to the Grand Canyon, go to Yosemite, go to Yellowstone, go to Denali, go to Zion. Any of those would work. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry?
What were your 3 favorite filmmaking experiences?
Well, for me, and I'll let Dayton answer that if he wants to answer it too, this happens in every film. And there are 3 points where you feel most closely happy that you do what you do. We were talking about earlier this just sort of guilty sense that you think at some point someone, the great auditor, is going to come and say, wait a second, we're paying you to go to the Grand Canyon or to stand in Yosemite Valley? No. Do you know this way, please? Because we do really think we've got the best jobs on the planet. We're happy to be contradicted if any of you also feel that. We're very happy if each person lives that thought. But for me, there are 3 moments, and one is when you're filming. And you've gotten up at 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. and you've driven like madmen down this dark road, and you've come to a point and you go rushing out and carrying your camera and you're waiting for the sun to come up, or some such, as Emily Dickinson called it, the far theatricals of day. And there's a shot, and it's going to be in your film. You know it, just because at that thing, it's just so spectacular, and you look at each other, and you're tired, and you're bleary-eyed, and you haven't eaten, and you're exhilarated, higher than a kite. And that happens, as you can imagine, in a project like this, over and over and again. And in that same category, discoveries in archives have that same sort of frisson, the same sort of sense of exhilaration, that there is the tangible proof that Theodore Roosevelt gave that speech on that rough-hewn platform in Gardner, Montana, to talk about the essential democracy of Yellowstone and, by extension, all the national parks, and that he understood something utterly American about them and was admonishing his countrymen to take care of these for future generations, for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. So you have that sense in shooting. But I must say that no amount of beautiful pictures, no amount of rare and never-before-seen archives, no amount of compelling interviews really matter if you haven't figured out a way to put them together. And so we take a script and we go into the editing room and we begin what is for us a multi-year struggle to figure out how to tell and retell these stories, what great stories actually don't end up in the film. It's often very painful for us, but like the movie Amadeus, has too many notes, particularly painful for the writer. We struggle to make scenes better within them, and there's a kind of exhilaration when you find out that by taking one little thing out, or by moving the beginning to the end, or the end to the beginning, that something comes together, and there's a shock that has to do with creation, in which all of these raw materials suddenly find some sort of purpose, and it has an equal, perhaps even more important exhilaration that takes place for us. And then the third thing is right now. There is a degree, if you might not have already picked it up, of evangelical fervor in what we do. It is not enough to make the film. It is not enough to speak to the choir. It's necessary to go out and make new converts and to sort of extend, as John Muir might say, the blessings of these mountains, to go out and get their good tidings, he said. And what we've done over the last year, which is completely unique, we think, in the kind of business we're in, is that we spend 10 times as much as anybody else traveling around, speaking to people, hoping to bring the enthusiasm we feel for this particular subject to them, and hope that they, in fact, will be inspirited and will go out to the park, will watch the series, all 12 hours, find out all about the creation of Yellowstone and all the parks that we cover, and all the amazing people that you saw just a sliver of, a glance of, but also then galvanize yourself into action to visit them, to protect them, to become the stewards that any citizen in a democracy is sort of required to do. I mean, those exhilarations repeat themselves in different films, but I must say that I've never had a film that's had this startling, mesmerizing, exhilarating set of experiences than we've had on the road for this film.
I have two statements and then a question which you may have just answered, I don't know. The first statement is that your films have certainly helped me learn who we are. Second is that I hope that this film spurs a much needed reinvestment in the national park system and in the staff. And my question is spurring that investment part of your intent in making the film?
We just want to tell a good story. We sometimes tend to, one sometimes tends to oversell these things. Having said that, we've worked really hard, 10 years, in fashioning a very complex kind of Russian novel of a story with, dozens and dozens of characters and plots intertwining and interbraiding like those wonderful rivers in Alaska, the braided rivers. And they happen to be set against this enormously beautiful backdrop. But that's what we've been doing. And when you do it, we also understand that when we let it go, it takes on a life of itself, and hopefully it does some things. And the one thing we would like is for people to go and visit their national parks. We would like them to become more conscientious stewards. We would like them to write those people who are in control of the park's destiny, that is to say, their congresspeople. We would like them to band together with other like-minded people to try to stop the inevitable intrusions that come in to the national parks and threaten them, either from within. Hetch Hetchy is a dam in Yosemite National Park that sort of ripped the heart out of John Muir at the end of his life because he thought the parks were inviolate. And here, San Francisco to this day still drinks the water of Hetch Hetchy. It's one of the most dramatic stories we tell. But also Hetch Hetchy has galvanized for more than 100 years, or almost 100 years, a conservation movement that's kept dams out of national parks. We hope people will be active in supporting them. There's a backlog due to the neglect of the previous administration of nearly $8 billion to $9 billion in much-needed maintenance and repair. We hope that can happen. And as the centennial of the National Parks Service approaches in 2016, we hope that the combination of ordinary folks and corporations and foundations and the government can work in concert, as we're all trying to do, to aid in the rehabilitation of these parks, as well as the first question suggested, adding new ones. So we've got a lot of things ahead of us. It's not our intention in the beginning, but we know from previous experience after the Civil War that battlefield attendance went up 200, 300%. And so we're looking forward to every park superintendent going, oh my God, here they come. Because that is just a great problem to have in a democracy. You know, a lot of different people. And we've also made a conscientious effort to reach out to African American and Hispanic communities and other groups that do not yet feel an ownership of the national parks, thanks to a Haas Fund grant that supplemented not only their generous grant to the production, but our educational outreach, that permits us to go into inner city high schools and show people heroes of the national parks, legitimate, authentic heroes of the national parks that look and sound like them. And we hope to build, as Stephen Mather said, better citizens out of those people who go to the parks. We firmly believe that active visitation of the national parks makes you a better American. It was implied in the introduction with Thomas Jefferson. Stephen Mather, the first director, said they were vast schoolrooms of Americanism. And while they may have been started for initially spiritual reasons, hey, this is so beautiful, we can't save it, or the kind of complicated economic reasons that Dayton suggested, or the conservation reasons of Theodore Roosevelt, the patriotic ones are also hugely important. And during the Great Depression, bad economic times, which we experience today, the parks paradoxically thrived as never before. So we would hope that in some way, now that we're done, hopefully telling a story that you find compelling, that it will have another life in galvanizing interest and support for the parks.
The question was, when we were young boys, were we in Boy Scouts or organizations that might have helped inspire us to make this film? I was a Cub Scout in a little town in Iowa that I grew up in, and was a Boy Scout for a while, but I wasn't a very good one. And they weren't that sad to see me not go for too many more merit badges when I decided not to go for too many more merit badges.
Same with me.
But
good Cub Scout, mediocre Boy Scout.
They're great organizations. It just, my life was taking some different turns. What this film, though, does come out of a little more of is when I was about your age, my parents, we went on the only real vacation that we were ever able to take. And that was borrowed the car from my grandmother. We borrowed camping equipment. We weren't big outdoors people because we never strayed very far from the little town I grew up in. Borrowed camping equipment from people we knew, and we did a 2-week trip that took us to Badlands, to the Little Bighorn National Monument, to Devil's Tower, to Yellowstone, to Grand Tetons, to Dinosaur National Monument, and through Rocky Mountain Park and back home. And that, in retrospect, was a very big moment for me as a young boy. I've spent a lot of my life as an adult driving around the United States, glorying in its landscape and how huge this country is and how varied it is and the people who live there. And I've also spent a lot of my time going around the United States trying to get to understand its history. And all of those things, at the moment of that trip, I didn't say, I'm going to be a writer who travels a lot and look into history. That was not. I still wanted to be, a professional baseball player or later a rock star. And you can probably see why that didn't work out. But in looking back, I think that trip lit something in me, an interest in who we are as a people and the continent that we did, and I loved that, and I've taken then my children to try to pass that love on. I think the thing about national parks is there's no hierarchy of the one way that you go to see it. We were filming near the rim of the Grand Canyon, and the tour bus would pull up, and people would, get down and come out to the viewpoint where we were filming. And both of us would say we're pretty sure that the sum total of the exercise that those folks are going to get this year was walking off of that tour bus and walking the 20 yards and peering over into the Grand Canyon and saying, wow, that's something, and getting back on the bus. And you know, the thing is, that's fine in my book, because I'll tell you, the next time someone wants to put a dam in the Grand Canyon, those people are going to remember that view, that moment, and they're going to say, don't you do this. And that's, you know, and at the same time, you can go to a national park and you can strap on a backpack, you can lose yourself in the wilderness for weeks, and that's fine too. And everything in between that, in my view, is fine, as long as you're not doing something that harms the, you know, the park, because it is your park, first of all. It's not Yellowstone National Backpacking Park. It belongs to everybody. And so you've got just as much right to go there, as long as you're not doing anything that's going to prevent the next generation and the next generation to go there. There's no one way to do it that's, you know, whatever it is that gets you there, that you remember, you cherish, and you bring from it a devotion to this great American idea and institution, and, you know, give a little back. The number one thing being, all that's asked of you is that you put it in your will for your children as an owner of these most majestic places.
We have one final question. This woman over here.
Hi. I was wondering, when you thought of making the film, that you must have had some type of preconceived idea of the story you would tell, and what was your biggest surprise in actually making the film that you hadn't thought of?
You know, I think that the most important thing you have to understand is that far too many documentary films are people telling you what they already know. That's homework. You know, that's something you take for credit. We would rather investigate something we don't know much about. I mean, we've been in national parks, we had experiences, but as we investigate these stories, it's our intention to share with you the excitement of discovery of these stories. And so in that regard, every day was a surprise. Every moment was a surprise. Every fact we learned added to the complexity and richness of the biographies we were trying to intertwine. Every time we went out shooting, just the glories of this natural setting awakened in us, you know, some of the most powerful emotions we felt that have spiritual, perhaps even religious for some of us, certainly patriotic, other emotions that just rearranged our molecules, just made us feel different, in which how we saw the light, how we looked at each other, how we treated each other afterwards. All of those things were transformed in these places, and therefore surprising. You know, we live so imprisoned by our modern lives, in a way. They isolate us. We're all independent free agents. You know, we drive in our car alone, we listen to the radio or surf the net alone, we watch TV alone, we play games alone. We're really isolated from one another. What's so amazing about the national parks is that they not only level experience in a kind of democratic sense, in a class sense, that is to say, it doesn't matter whether you're a billionaire or your mother is changing the sheets at the local Motel 6 just outside the park. You're, as Dayton is suggesting, a co-owner, an equal co-owner of the place. But there's a new kind of leveling that's permitted here that I think we weren't prepared for. Dayton referred to it in his remarks. It's that sense that every single one of the 50-odd people that we introduced to you in the film had some moment of personal transformation. It doesn't matter. You can add whatever label suits you, is comfortable for you. You know, you could hear it in Brad's voice talking about his experiences up on Denali. You hear it in John Muir's ecstatic musings about the power of things. You can intuit it from some of the rangers that you meet and the passion of George Dorr for Acadia. All of these things we found. But what was interesting is that every one of the people that we interviewed to help explain those historical figures had these experiences too, and we did as well. And so as Dayton said, we just found ourselves collecting not only this arc of a narrative, nearly as old as the country itself, and certainly as reflective of the issues and tensions of the country itself, but we also found these extra added free electrons that kept bouncing around and colliding and creating reactions that we were unprepared for. And we just, as Dayton said, just got out of the way and began to include them to sort of spice the film with them and pepper each episode with a set of these that have no real narrative purpose other than to intensify experience. And that's what we found most surprising, is that the national parks intensified human experience. We say it's America's best idea. We feel it represents our best selves. And those have a kind of grandiose, sort of marquee kind of effect. But we also know, and it's been so uplifting as a human being to experience, that they also have a deeply personal thing that just permits you to just change a little bit, to see things differently. John Muir would say that the paradox there, that he said in order to go in, you have to go out. In order to know yourself, you have to be out in nature. That's the only way it will take place. Our own Thoreau, right here, and Emerson knew this and tried so hard. It's the first democratic religious impulse, is transcendentalism, right? That you can find God in a cathedral in nature much better than in following a dogmatic devotion in cathedrals made by men. And so, we felt this powerful kinship with each other, with the strangers that were piling out of tour buses or walking along the rim of the South Rim going, speaking in German or Japanese or French, who had been drawn to that same je ne sais quoi about the national parks. And I can list thousands, the blizzard of facts we learned, the science that was just exploded in our heads, that's so exciting, that hadn't been exciting except in the national parks. The larger history that we've met. We're now working on a series on the Roosevelts, Franklin and Theodore and Eleanor, because we fell in love with them in the national parks all over again and decided to unite them in that way. But nothing come close to really just these personal experiences that made us participate in this kinship, that seeing your insignificance on the rim of the Grand Canyon paradoxically made us bigger, just as the egotist in our midst is diminished by his or her self-regard. And for me, every day of this production that I was involved was that kind of surprise, that kind of revelation. And what we wish more than anything, to go back to the subject of intention, is for everybody else to feel that as much as they can. Sometimes you can do it through art. We hope you'll watch the series, but it'll be a lot better if you watch it and then go out and see them. Because they will repay in dividends you never knew your country could pay. Thank you.